idea? Like how many pages?
Oh, God, thousands.
Thousands?
Yeah.
And he's written how much?
22 volumes at 1,000 each, so somewhere around 22,000 pages.
On medicine. Leslie, can you pull up the Ammon Hillman episode with Danny and cut to, it's going to be like the 28-minute timestamp somewhere in there.
Oh, there it is.
Where they talk about Galen. So Ammon Hillman, this episode with my buddy Danny Jones back in May, made a lot of noise. He's a controversial guy, but he studies a lot of antiquity languages. There's some where there's not really many people who speak it at all. But one of his interesting places of research, and I was showing you a little bit of this before we got on camera, is on Marcus Aurelius and his doctor Galen, who is a real key to what medicine during the Roman Empire may have looked like. So what I want to do is play some of this and then have you respond to it. So this is probably about 5 minutes in here. We may start and stop it as we're going, but Alessi, go ahead.
For people, also, to give some more context to people who are listening, who is Galen? Can you explain who Galen was?
Yeah, Galen is a 2nd century physician he works for Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, and he's probably one of the greatest intellects of Western civilization. Definitely. He wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and probably 10% of it has been translated, if 10%.
Wow.
And nobody goes near the pharmaceutical stuff. Now, in 2013, I saw for the first time a dissertation was written in which the person translated Galen's theriac to Paiso.
What's a theriac?
A theriac is a multi-drug component that's used to balance a poison or death bringer, they call them.
To balance a poison or death bringer. So like an antidote?
Yeah, exactly an antidote. But they called it a galenic reaction, unrelated to the reason of Galen.
Oh, okay.
A galenic reaction, that's the reaction. That's to bring the balance of the one that can kill you with the one that can keep you alive. Bring those together. That's theriac, baby.
Wow. Interesting. What's the point of that?
To die and to be born again.
To die and to be born again. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Do you want?
How much Galen have you read?
Considerable. Yeah, considerable.
How many? Give me an idea. Like how many pages?
Oh God, thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah.
And he's written how much?
22 volumes at 1,000 each, so somewhere around 22,000 pages.
On medicine.
And where does all this literature exist? Like, where is it being held?
It's held currently in a book that's sitting out in my...
You have all of it?
Yeah, I got it from Johns Hopkins.
Wow.
Yeah, because Professor Scarborough was in with all the book traders, right? And they were like, oh shit, Galen has become available.
Okay.
Can I run out and get Galen?
Les, real quick, can you check the next timestamp too? I want to skip ahead.
Galen book.
Real fast.
Here it comes with the original.
The one right after.
Original.
1840.
This is from 1840.
All right, so
what's the
the
date say on it?
33 drugs. Yeah. Grab that. Drugs in ancient Rome.
You're studying Galen, right? And you're working on your dissertation. And what happens next?
Oh, so for my dissertation, I did it on Roman pharmacy.
Okay, right.
And
Roman pharmacy.
Roman pharmacy. Okay. Nobody's written a work on Roman pharmacy, and I had already done a translation and commentary for a master's thesis. That's usually what they give to doctoral students. I had done one for a master's thesis, and I was like, I'm not doing that again. So I'm going to write a text that's just kind of a general Roman pharmacy text so that people can learn about drugs in the ancient world. And the committee told me, take out the chapter on recreational drugs, or we're not going to give you the degree. And
so you only had one chapter that was about recreational drugs.
Yeah. The rest were all medicinal.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
But didn't you say that they didn't distinguish between recreational and medicinal? Is that right?
No, that's exactly right. We were
Is that right?
distinguishing.
We do it now, but they didn't.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, back
depending.
then. Things that.
So everything he's saying about Galen is absolutely right. Galen is a doctor in the 2nd century AD who's enormously prolific. Actually, about a tenth of all classical literature we have written in Greek before the year 300 is by Galen. He's that prolific. And he writes about everything medical and some things that are not quite so medical, like philosophy and things pertaining to medicine. But Galen writes about antidotes, including this theriac that he's talking about, which is the supreme antidote to anything. The idea is that any poison will be counteracted by a theriac. And theriac means like wild beast, because it had viper flesh as one of its components. Kind of interesting.
Viper flesh.
Viper flesh, rotten viper flesh. Yeah, it must have tasted great. Along with like rare spices and stuff, which are supposed to deal with any kind of drugs you can ingest. But whether there was recreational drug use in the ancient world is very controversial because we just don't know. We don't have any evidence for it. They used opium pretty widely in medicinal contexts, and it stands to reason that there must have been some recreational use too of opium and even of marijuana, because hemp is grown widely for rope mostly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But no source mentions this. And as far as we can tell, their drug of choice is always just wine. Maybe wine laced with certain stuff, but always just wine. And so classicists get really leery about any kind of assertion that's not supported by at least one textual reference, something. And I imagine that his committee was really concerned about that there was no hard evidence for these same compounds, that they can be used recreationally, absolutely. But were they? We just don't know. We just don't have that kind of evidence. And so once you get beyond the evidence and begin speculating, then you're kind of blazing your own path in directions that can end up in really weird places.
Well, the other claim, I forget where it is in here, so I don't want to go looking for it while we're on air, but I think I can explain it enough for you to be able to give some sort of runway on it. But another major claim that Ammon makes from reading the texts of Galen and the diaries of Galen and the stuff that he would leave behind is and I think Ammon probably exaggerates it just because I think he tends to kind of do that. But like he does say, I think correctly, that Galen put Marcus Aurelius on various drugs, including theriac, that involved opium, so especially later in Marcus's life, and that I think Ammon takes it and says that like Meditations, for example, and Stoicism was written with him high on drugs like this. Is there evidence to back that up?
Well, we do know that he did take theriac from Galen, Marcus Aurelius. He had insomnia, and Galen would give him these compounds to help him sleep. And they did contain opium, not a ton of opium if he kept to his own ratios, but some opium, enough that he would feel it. We don't have any evidence, though, of the emperor being impaired in any way. No one talks about him, being drowsy or being drugged or in a stupor or anything. And what we have in Meditations is not all that organized because it's just jottings it's a diary pretty much, a philosophical diary, but it's definitely not a drug trance either. So I would be skeptical, I would say. Not that I can disprove that, I can't. But there's no internal evidence in the Meditations, I would say, that suggests here's somebody who's in an altered state. That's sort of my general sense of the whole thing.
Got it. And he's considered like a legend of the Roman Empire, Marcus
Aurelius.
Aurelius.
Oh, yeah. Both those men, both Galen and Marcus Aurelius, are absolutely pivotal in their fields, in politics and medicine at the same time. And it's really interesting seeing their collaboration in this sense.
Outside of some of these things we're talking about as it relates directly to Galen, like what were some major, if you know any, some major like medicinal breakthroughs that the Roman Empire was responsible for that we later built upon?
Mm-hmm. So Galen is actually the guy who was the most long-term influence on medicine. I think later in this interview they talk about how he was still being taught in the 19th century to doctors, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Galen pioneers a theory of the four humors. This is based on earlier Greek thought in some ways, but he systematizes it. And this is where we get pretty much all of medieval medicine from, that it's all about the balance of humors, or their disbalance or unbalance, that determines health or illness. That if your four humors, your various biles and bloods are in the levels they're supposed to be, then you're healthy. But if they're in some way out of whack, if you have too much blood, or too much bile, then you become ill. And that sickness and health can be reduced to the balance or unbalance of your humors. And this idea is incredibly influential in medicine, right until really the early modern period. That's what people are bled for that reason. They have too much blood. And so they take the blood out to get their humors back into balance.
Oh, that's cool. I never knew that.
Yeah.
There's so much that can tie back. Leslie, there's a map, actually. Can you type in Roman Empire veins map? I don't know if it'll come up. This is one of those things I saw on Twitter. I should fucking screenshot it. It was so cool. But the concept is like literally and figuratively everything ties back to Rome. Yeah, of course it's not going to come up. Type in blood veins map. Put blood in the middle of that. And then type in all roads lead back to Rome on the end. It's definitely. If I get it, I'll give it to you, and you can stick it in the corner of the screen. There it is. Yeah. Very first one right here. Yeah, it's like all the. We talk about the human body and how the arteries bleed off into the veins and everything, and it's like all these estuaries off the river up to the center. And when you talk about the influence of Rome, you can see the main artery all leads back to Rome itself on this map, and like the influence of culture in the West and even out into the East somehow comes back to that. And I think guys like, when you look at the life of like a Marcus Aurelius, between his own teachings and then how it even ties into the medicine he was given and the guy attached to that, like you can play those layers all the time
absolutely.
To bring it back in history. I mean, if I were you, like studying it at the level you do, like I'd be like a kid in Toys R Us every day studying this.
I still am, to be honest. There's just so much, and the joy that you can have in knowing you never will know it all. It's satisfying in a sense, You can never be a completist when it comes to Rome.
Hell yeah. Well, I was talking about your podcast earlier and some of the great guests you have on there. One of the ones I listened to is a guy I've been talking to a little bit over the last 8 weeks who now just showed up on Lex Friedman, Gregory Aldrete, who's awesome. But the episode you did with him was really cool because you guys discussed at length Cicero. And then also the second topic there I want to get into is like Roman oratory and how this relates to today, like in courts with lawyers and stuff. But first, just for people out there, like people have heard the name Cicero was used in Gladiator, but for real, like when we say Cicero in history, who are we referring to and who was he?
Marcus Tullius Cicero is the most important Roman orator. He's also perhaps the most important figure in Roman prose literature because the way he writes becomes the standard, pretty much, for writing Latin for the rest of antiquity. He came from a small town outside Rome, but was such a brilliant orator. He was educated in Rome and quickly became one of the leading lawyers in the city. He turned his eloquence into prominence in politics and worked his way up the political ladder and become consul in the 60s BC, just before Caesar. And while consul, he defeated a conspiracy by this guy named Catiline, who was a senator who was trying to overthrow the Republic. And his speeches against Catiline became classics, instant classics. And Cicero himself became a very well-known figure because of his leading the opposition to this plot. He was less important after this because Caesar and friends took over politics, and Cicero was increasingly sidelined. Eventually, he'd be executed by Mark Antony for writing a series of speeches in which he criticized Antony.
Can't do that.
No, that was a bad idea. It's like heckling the emperor. You just don't do it. But in the meantime, while he was kind of out of politics, he wrote a long series of treatises on everything from rhetoric to philosophy to religion. And so we have a huge number of works written by Cicero in his very fine Latin style. And for all those reasons, he's been incredibly influential on anybody who learns Latin. Because if you learn Latin, you read Cicero's Latin. He kind of defined the vocabulary and the form of the language it takes in prose.
But he had such a feel for the way to use the human body to communicate with your words. And like, I was trying to picture some of this when you and Gregory were talking on your episode, where it's like he would gather in these very public areas, not necessarily like a coliseum or something, but like out in the square, if you will, and he was very in tune with how he moved with his words. Like you were talking earlier about the guy in the show Rome,
right?
Who
Right,
was like the crier,
yeah,
or
same
whatever.
thing.
But so it's a very similar idea, and it sounds like he was like a real innovator with this.
He was, because he became the standard. Everyone wanted to be like Cicero for hundreds of years after he died because his works were, the works everybody read. A later orator named Quintilian wrote a manual covered a whole bunch of things about oratory, but among them was the gestures that you can use to appeal to a crowd. And most of these are pretty understated. They're kind of like, posturing the hands, appeal, but it is very mannered in a sense. You kind of, have a set of motions that are meant to convey to people who can't hear you very well, probably in the back of the room, for example, the kind of thing you're saying. And I don't have it memorized the way Greg does. He really can do the whole the language of gestures. But the idea is that your whole body is a vocal instrument. In the era before amplification, there's no stereo systems in the ancient world. And you're at the front of a long courtroom. The guy in the back has to know what you're doing. And if he can hear only a few words and watch your body, he'll know. And so it's practical as well as being, just good courtroom efficacy. Cicero inherited a long tradition of Greek oratory. That this is very well developed in the Greek world, but he really made it his own and made Latin oratory an incredibly effective instrument.
Yeah, and it's crazy because this can be used for great effective communication, and it can also be manipulated throughout history for negative communication. A guy who unfortunately was excellent at physical, I mean, who I'm going to say, at physical motion with speech was Hitler.
Right.
And so he had all this hateful rhetoric and said all these terrible things and believed in this crazy world domination and eugenics and all that stuff. But he could put an audience in the palm of his hands because, they could hear his voice, but they couldn't, they did have microphones at that point, but maybe you didn't always know exactly what he just said, but you could feel the fervor of what he just said, and it drew that charisma drew people to him, unfortunately, in the worst ways. But like, I would imagine if he were just doing a breakdown, someone like Cicero would just watch tape of what, Hitler was doing and be like, yeah, he got it.
Well, Hitler himself did. Famously, he'd tape himself during speeches and go back through it, and try to rehearse all the gestures. This is the classical language of oratory. That, the idea is that in every part of your body is communicating something.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.